I think, okay. All right, is everyone in from the waiting room, Melinda?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm sure they're trickling in as we speak. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, wherever in the world you are joining us from. Thanks a lot for being here with us today on day 2 of this discussion series on tackling the information disorder in Asia. So today we have 3 panels for you. One is the panel we're about to get into on funders and networks, and then followed by 2 more panels on the law and regulation, and finally researching and reporting on the information disorder. So just as Melindu mentioned earlier, we are recording this session, but this is just for internal purposes only. It's only for our records. We are not making it public, the recording public in any way, shape, or form. So just to let you know about that. Just a note as well for anybody who might want to join this session using Russian interpretation, we do have that function. So please click on the globe icon on your control panel, and our interpreter Azamat will be performing live interpretation of all the proceedings into Russian. Similarly, during the Q&A, if you wish to, we'll be taking questions via the chat. So if you wish to type in Russian, that's fine as well. Azamat will translate it. So just to let you know, you have that option. Right, so just as we explained yesterday, for those of you who were there, how the format of these panel discussions is going to work is we will first have a very short presentation of the report findings from the IDRC study that are relevant to each panel, and then we'll introduce the panelists, and they will continue the discussion in that way. So funders and networks. This panel arose because, of course, in order to do all these essential activities that people are conducting to combat the information disorder, whether that's fact-checking or digital literacy or researching, they need resources. And what we've observed in the Asian region is that people obtain these resources in a variety of ways. So for example, I mean, very rarely, but sometimes you'll have people doing it, fact checking or something purely on a volunteer basis. Extremely rare, but it does happen. Sometimes they're part of a larger organization like an NGO or a media organization or a newspaper. So that might provide a revenue stream. But one of the most essential ways of accessing funding in the Asian region still tends to be international funding from regional and global bodies. Funding is provided for a variety of activities. So that includes capacity building. So that can be supporting media literacy programs, training journalists in press ethics and other digital skills, fact checkers, providing access to fact checking tools and methodologies. Then there's also sort of general funding that gets provided, for example, a fact-checking organization to carry out day-to-day activities. And of course, much funding is provided for researchers in the region who are studying the information disorder and attempting to find solutions. However, despite the fact that foreign funding is extremely essential, it comes with challenges. And the folks working on information disorder in Asia in the region who we interviewed, they told us that these are some of their challenges when it comes to fact-checking and digital literacy training. Often the grants on offer tend to be short-term and only covers a portion of operations. So you can operate, but it might not always translate into something sustainable and long-term. Sometimes they can only find funding for very specific topics. Then, of course, there are regulatory problems because certain states will restrict funding from international donors, have extra requirements and so on. So that can be difficult to overcome. And sometimes, especially in high censorship environments, the credibility of fact checkers, journalists, and civil society organizations can be challenged by the fact that they have foreign funding. So critics, people who wish to discredit the work of fact checkers, journalists, and so on, will use this foreign funding as a way of discrediting and attacking the journalists. Another really important factor that we have is the certification process provided by the International Fact-Checking Network. Almost all the fact checkers we spoke to, they either had the IFCN certification or they were aspiring to it. So for fact checkers in the region, it's an extremely important certification because it confers, of course, a lot of credibility. It allows, for one thing, it's a marker of your reliability. It also opens up opportunities, for example, to become a fact checker for a social media platform and so on. However, despite the importance, a lot of fact checkers who were either trying to go through the process or wanted to go through the process said that there were challenges. So for example, in languages that are spoken maybe by not very many people, there are sometimes difficulties finding assessors who not only speak the language, but also have the subject matter knowledge, right, to do the assessment. Some of them said that they found it financially difficult in terms of fees and also resource intensive in terms of manpower required to commit to the certification process. So now we can get on to the panel, sorry, wrong slide. The panel itself. So where we have representatives from many of you from these international organizations who do extremely important work in this area. So I'd like to introduce Ruhi Asiwad of the International Development Research Center Canada. She's a senior program officer working in the democratic and inclusive governance stream. And she will introduce our panelists and start the discussion. So all yours, Ruhi. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ramati. And thanks very much to Learn Asia for doing this excellent work and organizing this really excellent discussion today, yesterday and today. I'm super excited to be moderating this panel, actually. We are a diverse group in terms of how we're working on these issues, you know, from the rule of law to peace building, to digital policy and to fact checking. So, and each of us is approaching these challenges in different ways. So first I want to just do a tour de table and allow everyone on the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the discussion. So Enoch, you're first on my screen, so please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Enoch Nyariki from the International Fact Checking Network. So I work as a community and impact manager for all verified signatories of IFCN's Code of Principles. So I'll be talking about that certification that was mentioned earlier and the challenges that fact checkers sometimes have acquiring that. Yeah, and more about the entire process and the work that we do.
Thanks. Stefan, you're next on my screen. So.
Yes, good afternoon from Singapore. Stefan Samse. I'm representing the Konrad Adenauer Foundation based here in Singapore. And I'm in charge of the Rule of Law Program Asia. At KAS at large, we take, for example, care of funding quality journalism, also taking care of mobile journalism as some of the elements. At the Rule of Law Program, we do take a broader approach. And we will, I guess, later get into the details when it comes to, you know, doing, I mean, supporting investigations and transparency, kind of indirectly supporting the tackling and the instruments and the issues one need, the tools that one needs to tackle information disorder. Thanks a lot for the invitation yesterday and today.
Aranya.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aranya Rajasingham from Sri Lanka. I'm a senior advisor at GIZ in the Strengthening Social Cohesion and Peace Building in Sri Lanka program. My work over the last 5 years also has included supporting reconciliation-related programs that GIZ has been working on, and primarily around public discourse and particularly strengthening civil society efforts in combating disinformation in Sri Lanka. Happy to be here.
Okay, Claudio, you're next on my screen.
Good morning from Barcelona, Spain. I'm Claudio Cesarano. I work as program analyst in the Europe and Eurasia program of Open Society Foundations. More specifically, I'm part of the technology and society team, where I focus on the impact of technology on information and democracy at large, so covering different topics and areas of work related to social media, but also including disinformation, which has actually been my focus in the last 2 years.
Thanks. Jean-Jacques, you're the final.
Thank you, Ruhia, and hi everyone, and thanks again for the organizers of the discussion series and for the report, which I think is very timely and very useful. So my name is Jean-Jacques Serre. I work at Google, head of content policy for APAC, which very much includes misinformation and disinformation. So with my colleagues, we work both on what Google wants to do inside the company about these tackling these challenges, but also the various practical initiatives and collaborations that we do across the Asia Pacific region with a range of stakeholders to try and address the problem in a comprehensive way. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, but in particular about some of the challenges that come with those collaborations and how we, well, hopefully how we might be able to get over those challenges and just really highlighting the importance of pursuing those collaborations. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I should also say I'm calling in from Amman, Jordan. So I'm struck by the fact that we've been able to assemble a panel from all across the, at least this part of this end of the globe. So I guess, these are tough challenges to confront as funders, but I want to jump in with a kind of a tough question, which is, how seriously do we think we're taking this challenge of information disorder, as outlined in the report, but also in general? And I'm going to put Aranya on the spot to answer that first, and then hopefully from there it'll flow into a good discussion. So yeah, so how seriously are we taking this challenge?
Thanks, Ruhia. I mean, certainly the fact that you see this room full of people here to talk about the topic shows you how seriously it is being taken. Even in the case of Sri Lanka, just 10 years ago, even though we had the research talking about the emergence of organized, hate speech and organized content, bots, we didn't have these kind of investments at that time. But now you have lots of donors keen to, understand, engage, and support local efforts. And also are increasing their investments. I mean, if you take just the program that I come from, didn't start off with a strong engagement on social media and disinformation. But in the last 5 years, the commissioners themselves, like the European Union and Germany, are now invested in increasing their commitments here to facilitate local efforts, right? So it's really, it's really a signal for us that not only are we as donors dedicated to engage in this arena, but it also signals something the report often highlights. It says, this happened in the Global South much earlier, we just didn't react in time. And, that interconnections of, how you can't actually compartmentalize what happens in specific countries and expect it not to impact others. Because we saw the algorithms, the networking strategies that were part of elections in countries like Sri Lanka, or a part of anti-minority violence, say, in countries like Myanmar, right? And we saw that playbook being used for other things, like whether it's elections in the US or whether it's Cambridge Analytica and the scandal around it. And I think this is the recognition that these increasing investments signal to us, that there is this recognition. It is important. It's important for a country like ours, or where we are situated in the Global South, as well as it obviously has an impact on everyone. So I think that's very promising. But I think what I also saw, when we, this report is first of its kind that kind of broadly brings together so many efforts. And I think that it also signals to the issues of jumping straight into, headlong into the problem, right? And this is what also happens when you take something seriously and you want to quickly act on it. And, I take this perspective also often in my work. And what happens is we turn ourselves into firefighters. So, as soon as we start just simply looking at the manifestations of the problem, so we see, okay, there's so much misinformation around this specific topic, so then have the fact checkers quickly address it, or, there might be some kind of electoral manipulation, then quickly elections related funding. And I think while we do that, and that's very important, I think another way, and this also comes in the report, like it already, when it's trying to understand the problem, it says the crux of the issue is that when we look closer at it, and we've seen it also here with our monitoring partners, that traditionally it kind of manifests things that are already happening outside of the digital world. And the marginalization or the polarization, the marginalization in terms of gender, ethnic and religious minorities, sexuality, sex, people of color, it's not new to us as an online space issue. And the report also says, actually hate speech in countries where you don't have a spread of an internet, right? Why are we investing so much in countries that don't have high penetration rates of internet or access to social media? And why is because it also impacts the way traditional news or channels. So word of mouth was one thing that really struck me in the report. And I think this thing, that the fact that digital is exploiting the existing prejudices or the historical exclusions is also key to the kind of investments that we want to make in supporting local efforts. And in our case, in Sri Lanka, because our project was directly acting during and after the Easter Sunday attacks, which was a coordinated attack on churches and hotels in 2019 in Sri Lanka. And as a repercussion from that, there was this onslaught on the larger Muslim population, which had nothing to do with what this small segment did. What was also, while shocking to see this, virulent hate speech or hate campaign against Muslim minorities, we also saw that online efforts that were positioned helped, and offline efforts, like what you traditionally think wouldn't fit into a digital peace building program, also fits. And it was that, that aligning of resources together to act to counter online hate speech that really prevented local violence. Like, in Negombo, this area where the church was, Unity of Negombo Citizens as a civil society collective going out there and protecting, but not necessarily being digital peace builders, but countering the disinformation that they were countering online in offline settings. So I think we are taking it seriously, and I think it's, this report provokes us to reflect on how we are doing it, Exactly.
Thanks very much. Who else wants? Stefan, would you want to go?
Sure. I mean, you put an easy question on the table, and that's an easy answer. Yes, we take it very seriously. Why? Because it touches the core and the center of our values. There is no halfway of fact checking or 50% of human rights when it comes to certain actions. So that's why we are extremely motivated, to support the issue and to invest as funder with our network and networks especially. But it is, and this has been, of course, also discussed in the study, in the report. I mean, we are focusing on the global South, but actually it is a global problem, very much so. But nonetheless, I mean, it is sometimes, and looking at Asia being so heterogeneous and so diverse, and that is also an aspect the report covers quite extensively, that of course requires that we take careful and different approaches. I mean, at the end of the day, there are no compromises, but we have to watch out, and we have to look at our targets and our goals. And sometimes we are, for example, as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, taxpayers, 100% taxpayers financed political foundation. We have 22 offices in Asia, and we are on the ground in having partners in even more countries. And that means for us and our work that we have to check, what our partners can do, how much they can do in the respective environments, what our local colleagues, our teams on the ground can effectively do, or where the limits and boundaries and borders of our work, of our funding of certain projects and programs can be seen at the horizon, so to speak. So this is sometimes a very thin line. And when we are drawing this thin line of looking at our work, we sometimes, we are not compromising, but we sometimes have to opt for, staying in and operating careful in some countries and with some partners than we do with others. Maybe so much, at this point at the beginning.
It is a global problem, but I do feel like the South has been, as Aranya also pointed out, does get overlooked. I mean, a lot of the literature focuses on the North, so that was one of the impetuses behind, supporting this work. Anyways, I don't want to talk too much. So Enoch, can I put you on the spot since you're coming from such an important fact-checking organization?
Yeah. And I also didn't mention that I'm joining you from Nairobi, Kenya, although my workstation is Tampa Bay area in Florida. So I'm a fact checker myself. I used to lead the largest team of fact checkers in Africa, and I thought I understand the issues that were raised in the report. So if I can comment on a few of them, such as the process of getting the IFCN certification. So some background, IFCN is this organization at the Poynter Institute that brings together fact checkers around the world. So it has a list of standards, which we call the Code of Principles, that fact checking organizations agree to abide by. So that's what brings the credibility, so that if you are a member of the network and your signatory status or certification is up for renewal every year, you agree to uphold certain high standards. And when you're a member, then you can begin to work with other tech platforms like Facebook, Twitter, I think also works with others and others. And that's why the standards are so high and the process can sometimes take long, but we are working to simplify it, to even mentor young fact-checking organizations that are aspiring to become members of the network, to even know what to do long in advance before making the formal application. Yeah, and we also do support the work of fact checkers through grants, and we see this issue of sometimes as a fact checker, your work being dismissed merely because you are receiving some support, some financial support from elsewhere. And as you might be aware, most of these organizations don't have massive resources, so they are non-profit, those that especially operate as standalone fact-checking initiatives, and they need this kind of support. And one of the principles that they agreed to abide by is being transparent about the sources of funding, and of course there's methodology, sources, but source of funding is very important, so that they are open. Like if you are getting some financial assistance from elsewhere, everyone knows about it, and you also retain the editorial independence. That's very key, so that those who support your work are not necessarily having a say in the work that you do, in deciding the claims you fact check and how you operate. Yeah, so that's very key, and it's also important that these organizations diversify their revenue sources, so that in case something happens to one source, they still continue to operate and fight the false information. And in the last few years, many have recognized that mis and disinformation can cause a lot of real world harm, because it touches on very key issues in people's lives, matters of democracy, health, and day-to-day choices that people make. So it's very essential that people have access to accurate information, and that the harm that could be caused by the false information is reduced. And that's why it's essential for fact checkers to partner with others to fight this misinformation at scale. If you don't do anything, let's say right now there are no fact checkers who are countering the false information, the world will be in chaos. There'll be confusion. There will not be an agreement on what's true. Voters won't have accurate information on who to vote for. Yeah, so you don't want to imagine what will be happening if we didn't have these efforts that counter the false information. And that's why it's great to have organizations supporting them while they try to also diversify their revenue sources.
Thanks so much. There's so many things I want to talk about, but actually I want to put my two other colleagues on, Jean-Jacques, do you want to speak to this question about how seriously, because I mean, you're obviously coming from an important institution within the ecosystem of information and disinformation. So please, and then Claudio, you next.
Yeah, thank you. I think, let me start with saying that our mission at Google since 1998, since when the company was created, was to organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. And so misinformation is actually the exact opposite of what a company strives to achieve. And so we've been trying to deal with it, to tackle it for several years now. And so we've come up with a multi-pronged approach, right? And try and be as comprehensive as possible in the way that we deal with misinformation. And there's broadly 5 pillars to that approach. The first one is more internal, if you will, is that the companies put in place policies and processes and resources and technology to prohibit and to counter misinformation and disinformation. So for instance, we have usage policies, community guidelines that very specifically prohibit deceptive practices, or that prohibit misinformation on COVID or on vaccines about COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So we have those rules of the road that explain what the right behaviors might be and how we deal with inappropriate behavior, including when it comes to mis and disinformation. And then we enforce those rules actively with thousands of reviewers dealing with those issues day to day. But it can't just be an internal work. We have to interact with the wider community. And so that a first step towards that, which is still internal, but getting onto the wider community, is that it's not just about removing bad stuff. It's also about encouraging good quality information to be consumed and for users to have access to it. So within our products, we have features that raise quality information. For instance, in our rankings, in our search results, you might see banners appearing that might point, for instance, to official information like the World Health Organization, information on COVID, that sort of thing. And then we move on to how we work with the rest of the ecosystem, in particular with journalists and a news ecosystem. So we have this program called the Google News Initiative to support journalism, to support the future of the journalism and innovation in journalism, so that we can continue to have quality and authoritative news content that is created, that is produced, and that gets disseminated both offline and online, so that, again, users have access to a breadth of information, and quality information continues to be out there. And then we continue across the multi-stakeholder groups, and we collaborate with the wider ecosystem of both news and journalists, but also the fact-checking community. And with them, for instance, we do various initiatives, including media and digital literacy, which we think is very important, raising awareness amongst the wider user community about misinformation and disinformation, helping them understand what's out there, how they might spot information and assess that information in a critical way, is an essential element of fighting the problem. And then we do some research, for instance, tech research, to get ahead of emerging issues, emerging threats, like recently things like deepfakes, for instance, and synthetic media, and how to get ahead of how to spot them and how to deal with them. But rolling out this sort of program is not always straightforward, and it goes beyond the funding, because there's nuances and there's criticisms and lots of different perspectives, right? So when you deal with sensitive countries, and we have a number of those in the region, in Asia-Pac, just the fact of having a fact-check center or a media literacy program in which a government is involved can be useful, because you reach, through government agencies, you can reach a large part of the population. But then you may be criticized for being biased towards a ruling regime. So we have to be careful about those sorts of associations, even though we know that we do need to collaborate with a range of stakeholders. And yet, if we don't work with the government, or simply if we just observe what's happening, we see that by the same token, the other way around, when we have independent fact-checking organizations, they themselves might be subject to criticisms. Sometimes there's calls for them to be replaced because they're described as inefficient or biased. And one might say that's actually the reality. The reason why that happens is because they happen to point out inaccuracies by certain politicians, perhaps, that they don't like. And we see that happen not just in sensitive countries. I've seen that in countries in the region that are actually fairly stable democracies. So that's a challenge, you know, who is right, and how can one organization be seen as credible and legitimate, or indeed tainted by association? And then there's criticisms that have just been mentioned by some of the panelists of where the funding comes from, or where it goes to. There are indeed companies that are prohibited from giving money to a government entity, or to for instance, a broadcaster that can be linked to a local government. And obviously, that's even more obvious in sensitive political environments. It's even more difficult. And at the other end, a very real concern at the moment is with disinformation and with state-backed propaganda. So if you have, for instance, a fact-check center that is supported by foreign funders, well, it can be easy for certain corners of society to point the finger at that and say, well, surely that's foreign disinformation, that's foreign interference. And you know, we have countries in the region that are passing laws about foreign interference, that there's a number of inquiries by various parliaments into the question. So it's easy to put two and two together, even if it's not correct, and say, well, if you have foreign funders, they might be there for the wrong reasons, even if it comes from supposedly innocent sources, right? So that's a constant challenge that we see, and that's the reality, right? We have to deal with it, and I'm not sure that there's an easy solution. So what I'm hoping is that, you know, a start would be to continue to have, to try and have a broad understanding, and therefore to give some legitimacy about what is the right approach to tackle misinformation, right? We really think, after looking at the issue, both here in Asia-Pac, but also elsewhere in the world, that the sort of approach that we have, you know, to tackle misinformation, but also to inform users, to raise awareness, to look at technology as well, and to do this as an ecosystem amongst multi-stakeholders is the right way forward, right? But we need to understand an understanding also of, you know, what good looks like, what a good fact-checking environment looks like, you know, how you need to have a truly independent, capable, knowledgeable fact-checking entity at the local level. There's examples out there, you know, like you can look at Taiwan, which is a major target of disinformation, but they've been doing really well. They've set up a strong fact-checking center, bringing together lots of stakeholders, journalists, academic experts, the tech community, and they've got links to the international fact-checking network. So there's that sort of independence and that credibility, that knowledge. We need to have those multi-stakeholder discussions, recognizing what good looks like, what a good fact-checking center, how a good fact-checking center should be set up and evolve. And once we have that understanding, comes legitimacy, and then it's hopefully a little easier to fund those efforts. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but we need to continue to look at it. So in short, in conclusion, I'd like to think that a good way forward is to continue to have and to have more regular multi-stakeholder exchanges like the one we're having today, that will lead to the emergence of an accepted understanding of what good looks like in fighting misinformation. And on top of leading to more understanding, I think those dialogues like today, I think will be helpful from a very practical perspective, because they can be a basis for more of those useful collaborations on the ground, and then also to encourage funding for those. So that's some of my thoughts in this area. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, IDRC has been supporting a fair amount of experimentation around different ways of countering this, but, I'm sorry, I really want to hear from my colleague from OSF first, and then, we have a lot to unpack here, so please go ahead.
Yeah, indeed. No, I'll try to be sure to leave more space for conversation also, because my colleagues also raised great points, so I don't want to repeat myself. So yeah, just on the question of how seriously we are taking it really seriously, because definitely disinformation, misinformation are threats to an open society. So we see it in elections, but we see also in everyday life, and is also having an impact on all the other fights we are focused on. So we see, for example, on climate, there has always been climate denial and disinformation, but now it's growing, and of course it is spreading as fast as faster than before. So what I want to say is that what we have trying to do is to diversify approaches, so to try and experiment to see what was working best. I think the challenge as a funder is especially that on this issue, we need to challenge our assumption all the time. First, because it is true that there is a body of research that is growing, and disinformation is not a new phenomenon, but it is true that the way that social media are structured, but also the economy behind that incentivize polarization changes how disinformation is produced and amplified. So we need to look at it all the time. And just to give an example of how, for example, we're trying to change our assumption. We, of course, fact checking was one of the first tools that we decided to fund. The original idea was, of course, that if we have more fact checkers, then it will be easier to counter disinformation, because people will be exposed to more facts. But actually, what it shows is that yeah, we are talking to we are preaching to the converted, basically, because people that are exposed to disinformation and believe in disinformation, then they don't look at the fact checking. But one great positive aspect that we saw is that fact checkers were actually great community builders. So inside, especially we have seen this with COVID, people were reaching out to fact checking organization to ask support, whether to understand the new information about the virus or the regulation that the countries were releasing. So in a way, fact checkers turned themselves into some sort of service journalism. And that had a great impact because they increased their community, but also on a very practical level, many of them were receiving donations. And those donations increased also during the pandemic, so which we all know was also a difficult time economically. So thinking that a community would want to give a donation to this issue, it means that they really think that they had an effect. I'll stop here, so we have more space for the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, does anyone have a hot pursuit to anything that's been said here? I mean, you know, I'm sort of, there's so many things I actually want to talk about, because I think this idea of the effectiveness of fact checking is a really important piece of this, because the assumption is of the rational actor who's going to be like, oh, this is questionable, let me go check to see if this is true. And that's not happening as much as I think we would hope it would be. But then at the same time, I was speaking to a grantee yesterday who made that very point that you just made, Claudio, that actually what they're finding is that there's this community that's building around the fact checking, that's almost like the way that LGBTQ populations have also mobilized as support networks. And that's such an interesting result of this. So let's just talk briefly about this question of effectiveness, and maybe Enoch, I can put you on the spot on that one. And then I also want to get to the question about long-term consistent funding, because that did come up a lot yesterday, and it will continue to come up. But let me first put you on the spot on this one.
Yeah, I agree that being part of a community is very essential for fact checkers to know that even when they go through challenges like targeted harassment, which we see a lot, they have like the support group. So what we have right now on the global stage, we have the International Fact-Checking Network, which brings together more than 130 fact-checking organizations, and we have them in just over 100 countries. But regionally, like let's say in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Africa, APAC, we have those small regional groups, which also involve fact-checking organizations that may have not made it to the IFCN level. And fact checkers, unlike where I used to be, the mainstream media, they don't see each other as competitors. So they support each other, to raise each other up, to inspire each other, sometimes to even collaborate on projects that can bring them some income to sustain their operations. So it's very essential to be part of a group, to collaborate, to work together, to fight false information, because that's like the overall goal that unites the global fact-checking community. So in the last few years, like in the last, I think 2 years since COVID, we've seen a huge increase as such of new fact-checking initiatives. On average, if you look at like the last 5 years, the number of new fact-checking organizations that have joined the International Fact-Checking Network is around 53. So 53 every year. Let me give you some context on that. It's not those that have joined the IFCN, those that have been set up and are doing like credible fact checking. And this is a report from the Duke Reporters Lab, a center at Duke University that does a census on new fact checking initiatives. So we've seen a rise, and of course, we've also, on the other side, we're also seeing more sophistication in the creation of disinformation campaigns. And there's also the argument that a fact checker is almost one step behind those who create the false information. And that's why we need to do a better job at media literacy campaigns by collaborating with others to educate the public to be more aware, to pre-bank, as they say, to be, if something has happened, a crisis like the shooting in Valde, people can anticipate the kind of false information that's likely to come out, and also to be more aware, to share less of that. Yeah, so to cut a long story short, being part of a community is very, very key in growing, in working together to fight the false information.
I saw both Jean-Jacques and Aranya make Aranya, would you want to speak to that? Because you do work on the ground as well with the peace building, and you spoke to that challenge of the cycle between the online and the on ground. So maybe you want to speak to the effectiveness question.
Sure. I think that, when Stefan talked about how there's so many different approaches, different contexts, I think what it also means is that, you have to also tackle that ecosystem that supports disinformation. So when you allow room for political corruption during elections, like if the legislation and its enforcement are not strong enough, you can be certain that it will be utilized through a disinformation campaign, right? So, and I think what we struggle with is the weight. So community is important, but some communities are more important than others. And I think this is where the donor community can play a role, because in smaller countries, when civil society advocacy groups come together, the weight that they have to pressure big tech is much less. And the weight that they have to advocate to the state is strengthened, it's bolstered when there are also, key trade partners also signaling that they have these expectations, right? So I think the key here is there are fundamental democratic standards that can be enforced through multiple ways. And it requires us to understand different objectives. So there are political objectives, there are profit-making objectives, but then to constantly find a way for what kind of future do we want to share together? And does that future include everyone? And I think these are the basic standards on which a community can be built and fostered to take action.
Someone else want to jump in? Jean-Jacques, do you want to jump in? Claudio? Stefan?
Let me be super quick because I think there's other questions that in this chat. I think effectiveness is very difficult to measure, unfortunately. Though I think we do see, you know, there are various ways to measure things. And I think I think the link between the offline and the online is important. We just need to continue to add resources to it, unfortunately, and get better at it. But I really do think that, you know, without going into the measurement just yet, I think a key in the effectiveness is going to be actually to join efforts, because at the moment there's a lot of different initiatives. And so there's a bit of loss, if you will, because we're not joining forces all the time. And I think that's a major issue. And I think there's a lot to learn from one another. You know, so there are some countries in APAC that have created some really, really strong bodies. I mentioned Taiwan earlier, but you can think about Mafindo in Indonesia, the local fact-checking community there. They've got some really interesting learnings that they could share with their neighboring countries about how to set up their local fact-checking communities. And when you do that, not only do you help the local structure being stronger, but then you can start thinking about initiatives that you can do at broader level across borders in helping users and reinforcing each other. So, you know, we don't have all the answers, but certainly I can imagine how difficult some people can feel that it is to talk to internet companies, but we're open. I'm here and we have some of those dialogues at local level. We've been talking to a few people in Sri Lanka, for instance, but also in many other places. So hopefully we can do more of those partnerships. That's certainly what I like to do across APAC. I really feel that we need a strong local structure or set of structures and communities working with one another in each of the countries in APAC, and then ideally have bridges between those local communities from one country to the other. And I think that's achievable, you know, and that will lead to effectiveness on the ground in fighting the problem. More people will be aware. We will have some of the basics like fact checking, etc., in place. Sorry, I meant to be shorter.
No, it's good. I mean, you know, these things also take time. I don't know about the other funders around this table, but we're also super, you know, we're also super busy. And so it's like these engagements take time. And that's actually why, like, we rely on our partners, i.e. the people that we support with grants, to do some of that like on ground, you know, meeting in order to sort of, you know, because as funders, we try to listen really carefully to what is happening and what our grantees are saying. And then, you know, to try to think from this kind of bird's eye view about how to do this work. As I'm being told by Ramati that we're sort of coming to the end of our conversation and to, hard stop now. So I do want to open it up for questions from the audience. So please put your questions into the Q&A. But we also do have some questions already from Halani asked a question about resources and talking about, it speaks to the question that I wanted to ask as well around the need for longer term. Everyone yesterday mentioned the need for longer term support and funding, but that also that support can come in various ways in terms of like resource support, like with data. And also Halani is raising the question about, you know, how can we put tax money behind this, and like what can funders do to support that ecosystem? So I want to open that up to someone here to answer. Stefan, I see you. So please go ahead, and then please also to the audience, just ask questions, please.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Just very briefly, because I think that Helani's point is a very crucial one. I mean, if it's important, then at the end of the day, why not use taxpayers' money to, you know, to set up tools to tackle the information disorder? And we are the best example for this. I mean, we are 100% taxpayers financed, and we are very much into, you know, those projects and programs. So I very much would advocate this. And, you know, just to sum it up, of course, we do need to directly tackle it and indirectly. It's of course, and that's more than just one of the results of today's discussion and the report itself. It is about multiple approaches. I mean, not only awareness raising, but the digital literacy and the constitutional literacy is kind of the political literacy of today. So I think it is very much about education and educating and providing the tools and mechanisms, you know, and for our target groups and the audiences.
Okay, actually, we have to wrap up now. I'm sorry, I thought we had 10 more minutes for questions. So I'm being told by Ramati that I have to close up now. But in any case, I mean, obviously, I think we've tilled the soil a little bit here, but we actually have a lot more to talk about. So I want to thank all of the panelists today for all of your insights, and I wish that we had more time to talk about this. So let's do it again. Let's actually get together and have more conversations to align the way that everyone's been talking about. So yeah, final thoughts from anyone here?
Maybe if I can jump on the question that was added to the chat about access to data. I'm very hopeful in Europe about the Digital Services Act as a piece of regulation, because it will introduce the obligation or the space at least to get data from platforms for researcher. We will still need to see how the enforcement will work, but hopefully this is a good step and could be also replicated somewhere else.
Excellent. Yeah. Jean-Jacques, please.
Yeah, just a quick one. And yes, we already make some data available, and we want to do more. Certainly, that's an aspect we'll look at. I think just generally, I'd love to continue this conversation. I think we need to. I mean, we have them, as I said, in a number of local setups, but I don't know if there's a way to continue this sort of discussion series. But I think we've only just touched on the surface. There's so much more we can share, and I think then that will enrich what we do on the ground, and I think there will be some useful initiatives that can come out of these sorts of dialogue. So I hope we have other opportunities soon to continue that dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming today. Wait, okay, no, I'm confused. Do we have 9 more minutes, or are we finished? Ramati, tell us, please.
I think we are wrapped up. I'm sorry. It was
Okay.
supposed to be 25 minutes for the panel and then 10 minutes for the Q&A. But I mean, I know people have posted the Q&A on the chat, so feel free to continue the conversation on the chat. Panelists, if there's anything you'd like to reply to, please feel free to put a reply in while we're going. Sorry if there was a confusion. It's just that the whole thing was supposed to be 45 minutes. So now we've eaten into the 45th minute.
Okay.
But please do continue via the chat. But thank you all so much. It was really valuable to hear from all of you, since so much of the designing and the programming really originates from your end. So that was really valuable. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Right, so let's just jump into the next panel. So I'll just give the breakdown of the times again to avoid confusion. So it will be 25 minutes of the panel discussion and then 10 minutes of Q&A. What I will do first is, What I will do first is just make a very short presentation of the findings that are relevant to each section, and then we'll go on to the panel discussion. So let me just share screen. Right, so this session is on the laws and regulations that are used to tackle the information disorder. This tends to be a bit of a controversial topic because there are lots of clashes with the freedom of expression. So let's get started. So what we've noticed in the Asian region is that some laws are explicitly used to target fake news per se. So Singapore's protection of false, or POFMA, is a good example of that, or the since repealed anti-fake news law from Malaysia. However, we've seen that other legislations can be used by governments in a somewhat roundabout way. By this, we mean that the legislation might not, say fake news or falsehoods in its title, but it will have provisions within it that will allow for the moderation of content, basically. So these can be defamation laws, hate speech and harassment laws, electronic transactions and cybersecurity, even colonial era sedition laws and disturbing the peace, of course media and publishing regulations, and recently we've seen very specific legislation dealing with COVID-19. The issue with some of these is that the definitions of the offenses tend to be quite broad. Application tends to be selective and politically motivated, and penalties are quite high. So there have been numerous examples of these throughout the region. We've just put some examples on the slides that we won't talk through all of them, but one very prominent case was the conviction of Maria Ressa and one of her fellow journalists on cyber libel for a news article they had written and posted online. Likewise, you can have the threat of legal and regulatory pressure and restrictions that are used to control media. So one example is how Himal South Asian, an online news magazine, said that they had to switch their operations from Nepal to Sri Lanka due to regulatory pressure in Nepal. And sometimes we've seen simply the threat of regulation or the presence of these regulations can encourage self-censorship. Because you don't want to get caught. So a key informant from Singapore talked to us about how POFMA created this pressure for them. We've also seen very specific laws used to combat fake news of COVID-19. There has been a lot of talk about COVID-19 and it being an infodemic and misinformation and so on, which is a problem. False news related to health is an issue. However, we've seen many examples of states taking advantage of this in order to suppress criticism, for instance, of different governments' handling of the pandemic. Fines, arrests, and so on have been carried out for those who have criticized the state's COVID response as well. There have been very specific measures also passed legally to prevent the spread of fake news due to COVID. So some examples are the Malaysian Emergency Ordinance, Vietnam's Fake News COVID Degree, and the Filipino Act. So to discuss some of these issues further, we'd like to introduce Gehan Gunatilaka, who is an attorney at law from Sri Lanka. He's highly experienced in this area. So he will introduce the panel and proceed with the questions. Just a reminder again about timing. We'll have a 25-minute panel discussion and then go on to the 10-minute Q&A. And if it helps, we will signal the time. So Gehan, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Ramata. Can I be heard?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, my voice is not going to be great. I've just been tested positive for COVID. And that's unfortunate. Yeah, so I might be a little biased when it comes to fake news laws on COVID, given my condition. We have a lovely panel today, and I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, but I just want to thank Ramati for framing the discussion with that report, because obviously, as Ramati mentioned, this is an extremely contentious topic because there is a push for more legislation to deal with disinformation in some jurisdictions, but also civil society and especially the journalistic community have warned against more laws on fake news and disinformation because of the likelihood that these laws would be applied selectively in bad faith and against political dissenters and media personnel. And we're seeing from practice, we're seeing that this is in fact a problem in lots of jurisdictions, which Ramati's report actually highlighted. We have a wonderful panel today, and I'm going to just very briefly introduce each speaker, who will have 5 minutes to sort of comment on the report at large, but also on specific questions that I'm going to raise. We're going to start off with Joanne Ding, who's from the Center for Independent Journalism in Malaysia. Joanne, I'm just wondering, Ramati mentioned the law in Malaysia, the fake news law that had a relatively short time span. I wonder whether you could briefly reflect on the lessons that can be learned from this emergence and eventual repeal of the law. And also maybe perhaps comment on how and why a temporary law on disinformation dealing specifically with COVID-19 was later enacted in Malaysia despite the repeal of that general law. Joanne, over to you. We have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Gehan, and I hope you feel better really, really soon. And thank you for still being here. Well, Malaysia has had 2 fake news laws. I know some people, you don't even have 1. We have had 2. So, but nothing. But both have since been big thunderstorm now in Malaysia. It's probably during the biggest corruption scandal of the decade, the 1MDB scandal, where our Prime Minister was daily being called a thief and a kleptocrat. The second was in 2021, when the government was facing a legitimacy crisis, and it was unclear whether they even had a majority in parliament. The government then declared an emergency which prevented parliament from sitting and enacted this anti-fake news law, ostensibly for COVID, but conveniently also criminalizing the sharing of false news about the declaration of the emergency. So it shut down discussions about why was the emergency declared and who would benefit from it. So, I mean, one thing we learned, I suppose, is that during a legitimacy crisis for the government, they generally think, well, now is a really good time for a law to control stuff that is said on the internet. Did it work? I mean, even for the cynical reason of controlling the narrative, if we take it from that angle, to stop people calling you a thief and incompetent, you could say it didn't really work because Najib, our Prime Minister, lost the election in 2018 historically, which led to the repeal of the law by the new government. And in 2021, the Prime Minister had to resign, and when emergency was revoked along with the law. These laws were so unpopular and so obviously not in good faith that they became almost a symbol of the government's loss of legitimacy and such a political hot potato. And I suppose we also learned it's always worth opposing a bad law, and Malaysians are not always united, but we were united in recognizing the hypocrisy of this law as just an opportunistic attempt really to control the public narrative, and roundly rejected it. The new government only lasted 2 years. They promised a slew of reforms, but they accomplished little in their 2 years. But one thing they did do was get rid of the anti-fake news law just because it was so incredibly unpopular. Did it work to curb misinformation? Well, considering it was never set up genuinely for that purpose, in my view, it would be difficult. But my comments on that, even broadly, both laws were so broad and so vague that it would have limited efficacy. Everyone probably broke those laws 5 times a day without knowing it. So it's very open to selective prosecution and abuse, and it put immense power into a government that was desperate to take control of the narrative. And it was complicated because politicians are often the biggest disseminator of disinformation and misinformation. And the phenomenon of misinformation cannot be legislated away, no matter how tempting it may seem to governments. I mean, it's been discussed here a lot these 2 days. It's complex, it's nuanced, it's about how we consume news, how we pass on news, it's about the algorithm, it's about confirmation bias, the polarization of society, the human tendency to gravitate to clickbait. Distortion has become the norm, and so it's about media literacy, fact-checking, freedom of information, credible media. So it's not just the law. And for COVID, in fact, what worked well in Malaysia was consistent and clear messaging from the Ministry of Health and the minister in charge of vaccines. They did that. I mean, the government did very badly on certain things, but they did very well in terms of consistent and clear messaging about COVID and how to prevent it. So most Malaysians indoors, you would see almost 100% masking in malls, and 97% of the adult population is vaccinated. And I don't think that's because of a harsh law. So just to round up, I mean, our fake news laws were therefore both overkill and underwhelming at the same time. So to the unfortunate individual who is charged for an innocuous Facebook post, it is a sledgehammer coming down on a fly. It is a very blunt tool that creates a general chilling effect. But for the actual phenomenon of misinformation and disinformation, it is like a chisel chipping away at a mountain, and did very little to address the distortion of facts that occurred in everyday lives.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And a point you raised about state-sponsored disinformation is something I want to return to later in the panel discussion. I think that's a really important point. and the question of whether laws can even be used to deal with that kind of disinformation is a really pertinent one. I'm going to now turn to Mong Palatino, the regional editor for Global Voices in Southeast Asia. Mong, thanks for joining us. And my question to you, with your experience and background, I was wondering whether you could reflect on the role of legislators in drafting clear and precise laws to deal with the worst forms of disinformation, kind of related to the point that Joanne just raised. For example, the types of disinformation that incites others to commit violence. Is there a genuine prospect for such laws to really be enacted in Asia?
Thank you, Jihan, for the question. Let me start by stating that I think our problem is not that we have bad new laws, but the fact that we have bad old laws, even old colonial era laws that are still in effect. In the Philippines, for example, we have the cyber libel, but the original evil here is the libel law, which has been used to target critics, but most especially journalists. Across the region, we have sedition, incitement, defamation, which are being upgraded in the age of the internet. Instead of repealing these obsolete provisions, they are being weaponized as tools to crack down the opposition. During the pandemic, the public health crisis was invoked to justify the introduction of laws and regulations aimed at preventing the sharing of so-called fake news. 2 years later, it became clear that these measures were used to criminalize dissent. They were abused and misused to silence critics. They were legislated to restrict the civic space rather than protect public health. Also, it became quite tragicomic that the source of fake news were not the irresponsible netizens, but also authorities themselves. Again, using the Philippines as an example, we have President Rodrigo Duterte advising the public to use gasoline as disinfectant against the coronavirus. So for legislators, they naturally turn to legislation to assure the public that they are doing something during an emergency situation. So my suggestion to civil society and to other stakeholders as a former legislator, first, do not assume that legislators know what they're doing when it comes to internet legislation. We have to engage them and inform them that legislation of harsh or police measures, the promotion of digital rights, access, data protection, privacy. Second, we have to remind them that the various models that they are adopting in dealing with the disinformation is not the default model of criminalizing disinformation. Instead of addressing repression in society. So, and third, let's state first that instead of adopting new laws, do we need new laws? Or why not recommend the funding and rollout of programs promoting digital and media literacy? Focus on these public initiatives, both national and local programs aimed at educating the public on countering disinformation. Fourth, we need to create a consensus that the best way forward, long-term, is to strengthen media freedom, reverse censorship, support institutions providing the public with verified information, support local newspapers, the struggling independent media, and other civil society groups whose initiatives fulfill the public's right to information. And finally, legislators and authorities respond to extreme scenarios. Let us identify the problem as tsunami of disinformation. When there is a real tsunami, you can't do anything about it if it's already in your face. The best time to prepare for it is before it hit the ground. So prepare the communities, identify the exit and safety evacuation routes, devise an alert system, teach the public about how to react to a tsunami. The same applies when it comes to the tsunami of disinformation or infonami. Let us prepare our communities, devise an alert system, teach people how to detect and counter disinformation. Let's persuade legislators that there are other ways of dealing with disinformation rather than new repressive laws, but funding, subsidizing programs that will help the public.
Thank you very much, Mong. That was really important. And the points you raised, I just wonder whether I can ask you to summarize your points one more time, because your connection dropped when you were making those points. I think you raised 4 or 5 points. You can just summarize them very quickly for our audience. I think that'll be really helpful, because I think they were quite important.
Okay, so I think remind legislators that there are other priorities on internet legislation, like access instead of police measures. A second, we have to remind them that instead of the default model of criminalizing disinformation, there are other models that can be used. And third, we need to inform them that long-term strengthen media freedom, reverse censorship. And then fourth, we have to fund programs instead of new laws. Roll out programs, public initiatives by the media, by civil society for media literacy. And fifth, prepare the communities, like preparation for a tsunami. Prepare the communities, educate the public, and exit route safety measures, detect disinformation.
I think that's really helpful, Mon. Thanks very much. I'm going to quickly turn to Shamla Khan from the Digital Rights Foundation in Pakistan. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to just touch on some of the major risks of criminal law approaches to addressing information disorder. And I think one of those major risks, and something that Mong and Joanne and Ramati in her presentation, they've all raised, is selective and bad faith application of criminal law to target dissenters and critics of the state. I think that's one of the main findings of the report that we're discussing as well. Given the practice of selective application of such laws in Asia, the question I have for you is, should rights organizations in the Global South simply resist all attempts to introduce new laws on information disorder? And additionally, as Mong raised earlier, should they be calling for the repeal of archaic laws that are being weaponized to target dissenting voices? Over to you.
Everyone. I think it's a sort of very important question for us as civil society to reckon with, because a lot of times sort of our advocacy is undercut by the fact that, we are asked for, are there sort of any alternative solutions or any alternative models of laws that we would like to propose once we're doing that opposition to a lot of laws. But it is worth sort of looking into the fact that a lot of the laws that are put forward, the intention behind them is very obvious on the surface. And the overuse of criminal law as a blunt instrument to regulate speech has never really ended well. I haven't come across any kind of model where this is a good idea. And especially, I think over time, if I sort of look at the kind of sort of legislative moves that have been made in the Pakistani context as well. So if you look at sort of criminal defamation provisions which have existed in the penal code long before digital media came about, which is already a sort of very regressive way of looking at speech laws, and has been used a lot of times to address information disorder. The use of criminal defamation laws has been a very sort of major trend that we're seeing. But even sort of those initial colonial era laws still have more caveats than the kind of laws that are coming now. So what I've seen is actually a much more sort of authoritarian bent in the kind of sort of just on the surface, what the laws are saying are a lot more sort of, they're vaguer, their scope is wider, it gives a lot more authority to the government. So even within that sort of historical sort of overview, I think things are actually bending towards authoritarianism a lot more. And the sort of problem inherently with criminal law is, as a way to regulate speech, that it will inevitably, especially when you think of the internet, there will be millions of sort of articles of speech where the government can sort of take action on, but it will be, and evidence has shown throughout sort of these jurisdictions and in the monitoring that we do here as well, that it is being used exclusively to silence dissenters, activists, journalists, most of the cases actually under the criminal defamation law have been against journalists who have been sort of critical of the state. So because of this misapplication, I am also of the view, and I think a lot of sort of civil society actors are, that criminal law at least is not a good instrument to use when it comes to sort of addressing disinformation. But then you come to sort of other tools that governments have used, for example, content moderation legislation, where removal of material, not criminalization, but removal or sort of asking social media companies or putting obligations on them to instantly remove anything that is declared illegal or disinformation or fake news. These concerns are showing up in other kinds of legislation. Interestingly, for example, in Pakistan, there was recently a bill for journalist protection that was passed, but one of the laws, one of the sections within the law also put obligations on journalists to report accurately. So these are other ways in which sort of governments are getting at sort of trying to address disinformation through the law. And I think it's quite a slippery slope, especially sort of even in terms of content moderation rules and regulations that are coming in. You cannot take the same approach for categories of speech, for example, such as child pornography and disinformation. Those are very different things. We need to sort of look at disinformation, even when it's not being penalized, but just removed and censored. It needs to be sort of in a much more sort of concerted manner, done in a much more thoughtful manner, actually. And lastly, another tool that governments are also using is sort of laws that are able to justify internet shutdowns or sort of complete banning of certain platforms where they feel that fake news or misinformation is quite prevalent. Those kinds of legislation are also sort of overly broad, disproportionate ways of getting at solving this problem. So I think sort of I have yet to see any sort of very thoughtful legislative intervention that actually addresses fake news and there is this tendency by governments to overuse criminal law, which should be sort of rejected outright. And with other sort of legislative interventions, I think there is a lot of sort of proof to go around where they are not targeted, they are not proportionate, they're not sort of narrowly tailored a lot of the times, and are just sort of an excuse for governments to amass sort of more power. And you can sort of see that sort of malicious intent on the government's part, I think, in that sort of selective application, but also in how these laws are worded and the way that sort of recently sort of the criminal defamation law here was regarding online speech was amended through an ordinance where public figures were actually included, or criticism of public figures was included. So that off the bat sort of tells you the kind of sort of intention that a government has. So we need to look at like even laws maybe in their sort of, you know, embedded within the political sort of will and the social circumstance in which they are passed. So yeah, I think I'm slightly over time, but yeah, look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Smaila. I just wanted to recap a point that you raised, which I think is a really important point about the trends that we're seeing currently in terms of the scope, the authoritarian nature of some of the new laws. And one of the narratives that that governments repeatedly put out is that this phenomenon that we're going through, this internet-based disinformation, is so new and so sort of dangerous that we need very sophisticated laws to deal with that. And I think some portions of the public buy into that because disinformation has been at the heart of global phenomena. COVID is one, but also Brexit and the election in 2016 in the US, disinformation was very much at the heart of it. And I think governments have been quite clever to utilize that narrative to justify laws that really only promote their interests. And that takes me to an interesting point about state-sponsored disinformation. And I'd like to invite Juni Soeharjo, an expert on journalism and media law from Indonesia, to actually comment on that. And my question, Juni, is that the state is often one of the main perpetrators of disinformation, right? And in fact, if you think of the etymology of the word, it has its roots in state-sponsored propaganda. And given that states are unlikely to enforce anti-disinformation laws against their own agents, what is the role of law, if any, when dealing with state-sponsored disinformation? And the question, I suppose, is there's one thing to worry about when we think about bad faith application or selective application of laws, but it's a whole different ballgame when we're thinking about state-sponsored disinformation, because then laws are not going to be applicable or even utilized in the first place. So I'd like you to comment on that, Junie.
Thank you. Good afternoon in my place, and good morning or good night, respective panelists and participation. My name is Junie Suharjo. I am currently working as an expert to Press Council or Dewan Pers in Indonesia. It means the regulator for the media or journalists in Indonesia. Gian, can I share some screen? Because it will help me to take.
No problem. Ramati, is that possible? I think.
Yes, I think, Junie, you should have a permission to do that, I think.
Because it will help me to make sure that I'm not going to abuse my time. Have you seen my screen sharing? Okay, how can I do this? Okay, maybe you will understand why I put my presentation with the police, a police officer comic in my presentation. The first one, in Indonesia, there is a rare flower called press egg. It was enacted in 1999 during our Reformation era, when Suharto, at that time already in power for 32 years, is toppled by the power of the people. And suddenly in 1999, we have a rare flower called the Guardians of Democracy, in ensuring our journalists are protected when conducting their tasks, and that the media must not be sued with penal code, but instead to be judged according to the Press Act and standards given by Press Council. The second one is this rare flower, ensuring all journalists are in compliance to Code of Ethics when producing journalistic products. So because you asked me what is the main disinformation agency, I have to say to you again that Press Council is actually a state agency. Surprise. And at the moment, this special law, the press law, is under attack. For all this information or misinformation in Indonesia, usually people uses Press Act, the Electronic Information and Transaction Act. The third one is the penal code, the one from colonial times, but it's very unpopular at this time, unless we talk about the blasphemy parts in majority of religion. The second one is the only government institution or agencies concerning the information is only Press Council and Ministry of ICT. For your information, Press Council is called a quasi-state agency because it is mandated by an act, but all the representatives that took place or who are responsible to make sure that the journalism sector is in a good or in smooth and ideal condition is from constitutions. We have 10 constitutions, which are the Association of Media, Association of Journalists, and so on. The second one is Ministry of ICT. The Ministry of ICT, actually, they don't have any intervention, or there is no, so whatever, there is no access for them to make sure that we are feeding by disinformation by the government. At this time, challenges faced by media is this past 3 years almost is digital disruption, pandemic, COVID, intervention by owner, of course. Owner, of course, we are talking about political interests. The fourth one is employment termination because it's a digital disruption, making all the income decreasing very, declining very, declining very seriously. And the last one is decrease of revenue by traditional media. What I meant by traditional media is television and printing media. However, the misinformation is done by conduits of information. Majority is done by social media, by Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. I don't know why they put WhatsApp in this social media, because for me, WhatsApp is not a social media, but most of my countrymen call WhatsApp a social media because they think that people can share information through WhatsApp, so they call it social media. The other one is there is a newcomer in the stakeholders. There is a working opportunity using conduits of information in Indonesia during presidential and regional election. It's like the seasonal pandemic where political buzzers who target in issues of social, political, and economics, and sometimes in familial aspect. It creates deep distrust between ethnic groups, different faiths, and certain social classes. In some cases, it got into political fights physically. And the deep divide is still felt to this day. The start of this information in litigious aspect is the Act of Electronic Information and Transaction. This act actually is passed because the people from the business sector wants to have some kind of evidence that can be brought into the courts. So anything without in the paper, but in digital format, that can be brought into the court as an evidence and legal evidence. Actually, these times, I have to say that the National Press Council is making their way to make sure all the police or the legal enforcer to pay attention to the Press Act instead of using Electronic Information and Transaction Act when they want to sue or to make to penalize the journalists. So we make sure the journalists are being protected by the Press Act, and it's still ongoing process. That's it. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Juni. We have some time for questions. I think we have about 8 minutes left for questions. And one of the questions that have been raised for all the panelists, and maybe one of you can take a stab at this, is that many but not all of these laws originated during colonial times. Example, sedition, penal code offenses. And the question is, what's your view on why these laws have persisted into the present day? Anyone?
I think it reflects a lack of political will, and this related to the refusal of politicians to be made accountable for their actions. So I think there should be a movement of stakeholders of the community to pressure the government to review, at least review and repeal these laws.
And I think that, thanks a lot, Muang. And I just want to turn to Shmaila, because one of the points you raised, Shmaila, is that even though we have these older laws, we have had a trend of new laws coming in, which with much broader scope in terms of what they deal with. So on the one hand, I'll take a quick example from Sri Lanka. We've had the police ordinance that deals with false reports that can cause panic amongst the public. And this is a very old provision. It dates back from the 1800s. But incidentally, it's almost never used. And what's used instead is a much newer laws, the Computer Crimes Act or the ICCPR Act, which is ironically based on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but is used against dissenters. So on the one hand, we do have these older laws, but on the other hand, we have new laws as well. And I wonder whether, Shmaila, you'd like to just comment on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, definitely lack of political will exists. I think there's also sometimes when we think of like sort of colonial laws, we think of like sort of the sudden break after colonization, and somehow the state itself was it transformed, whereas there's like sort of the same kind of tendencies to exercise control, administrative, political, social control actually existed in the post-colonial era as well. So these laws actually really quite nicely lend themselves to initially the process of nation building. They were quite useful to sort of stamp out any kind of dissent that maybe presented any kind of like sort of opposing views regarding what these new nations could be. And we now see those same sort of tactics being employed. So I think the sort of violent nature of the state hasn't really changed despite sort of that decolonization, and that is a sort of that tendency for control has persisted beyond the colonial era. And just to sort of talk about sort of the new laws, a lot of times they are borrowing from the sort of older laws as well, adapting them. For example, this tendency to have laws for the digital space, criminal laws for the digital space. A lot of times, like at least in our experience in Pakistan, we saw that there's a lot of sort of copy pasting of like sort of something from the penal code and just sort of changing it up, keeping its essence and sort of putting it in the digital context. So I think sort of they have proved to be quite useful over the years for these governments, and there's lack of sort of incentive or accountability for them to be scrapped. I think sort of the logics of the state have remained the same, whether it be colonial, post-colonial, or digital era. There is a continuity that exists, and we see the same kind of tactics sort of prop up over and over again.
Thank you so much, Shmaila. That's a really interesting question on the role of tech companies, and you know, how does the panel really feel about intermediary liability laws? And I'm going to connect it to another question that has been raised about the German NetzDG law. And I must say that this is a law that a lot of people in the global South that are interested in, you know, a very criminal law approach to disinformation often cite and cite badly and cite out of context. But you know, we have the narrative that, you know, if Germany can do it, why can't we just borrow from that? And I think I've been in a number of discussions, including with the members or representatives of the Ministry of Justice in Sri Lanka, where the argument is that, you know, we need a law to at least deal with intermediaries because they are the real problem here, and countries need to replicate laws similar to the NetzDG law. But the question is, but the same law in one of our Asian countries could be implemented and used very differently. And I think it's a really important point. So are we still thinking around the edges, asking for better fake news content laws, or should we radically rethink this? And I think one of the dangers of exporting laws from jurisdictions that are very different to jurisdictions in Asia is that we end up with situations where governments are just expanded in terms of their power to apply new laws in bad faith. So anyone wants to take a stab at this question?
Yes, I can take a stab at it.
Yeah, thanks.
So there is a spectrum, right, when we come to
Joanne, I think we've lost you. Okay, while Joanne gets back online, does anyone else want to comment on this particular question?
Intermediary liability from which would mean that either Malaysia can, yes, sorry.
I think we lost you for a second. Yeah, we lost you for a second. Maybe you can start again. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. So Malaysia Kini, one of our independent news websites, was fined $100 $125,000 for contempt. Oh God. I'm so sorry.
No, you're back now. You're back
I
now.
think the storm is, okay, let's try again. Malaysia Kini fined $125,000 for third-party comments on their website, which would mean for contempt of court, which would mean they either had to vet all their comments, which would be thousands of comments daily, or take a legal risk every day. So I think we have to approach internet liability extremely carefully because of the impact that it could cause to media companies, especially to media outlets, and to anyone hosting a website or an app. And there needs to be a multi-stakeholder discussion, maybe about transparency, about the algorithm. And we have to take into account the broader context. The Malaysia Kini judgment quoted Delphi and Estonia very liberally, but the condition in Estonia and the condition in Malaysia are completely different. One is the top 10 in press freedom, and one is the bottom 100. So, I mean, past 100, 118 or something. So we have so many laws. We have sedition, we have everything that Heliani talked about. There's sedition, we have a Communications and Multimedia Act that is very broad. We have printing laws that make it difficult to enter the market. So when we have this whole context where it is so difficult already to express, and there are already so many laws that stifle the media, if we are going to go into internet intermediary liability laws, this may make it even more difficult for media companies in a already challenging environment to operate, and especially to host comments on their website to garner discussion. So it's a very dangerous ground to go into, but the discussion must be held in a multi-stakeholder environment, and governments should not rush into it, especially given that we have very different contexts to Germany or Estonia, where they have had these discussions.
Absolutely, Joanne. And I think another point that maybe is important to reflect on is that tech companies will be driven by profit and market share, and they'll be happy to cooperate with a lot of governments if that means maintaining their market share in a particular jurisdiction. So having these intermediary liability laws is not going to necessarily improve our freedom of expression or the quality of freedom of expression online. In fact, it will go very much the other way if tech companies and states actually cooperate and are complicit in a common agenda. I think we've run out of time. We've had a wonderful series of interventions. Thank you very much, Joanne, Mong, Shmaila, and Juni, and Ramati for your report. I think the discussion needs to continue, and it was important to hear a broad consensus on the danger of laws and regulations, particularly in the global south. So with that, let me hand over to Ramati. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Gehan. Thank you to all the panelists. Gehan, I hope you get well soon. Thanks for braving this panel with COVID. That's much appreciated. So let's get on to, the final panel of the day, which will be on researching and reporting on the information disorder. So as we said earlier, just to remind the format, we will have a quick presentation of the report findings, and then we will move on to a 25-minute panel discussion and the 10-minute Q&A. So let me just share screen. Right, so session 6 on researching and reporting on the information disorder, final panel. So we have been talking a lot about the problem of information disorder, but in order to deal with the information disorder, we have to understand the phenomenon first. And many researchers across Asia are increasingly studying the problem, and they use a variety of methods in order to do so. So, for example, qualitative and quantitative methods can be used to research news consumption habits. You can use big data research methods to maybe map the spread of content online through a platform. You can do analysis to measure, research and analysis to measure the impacts of interventions. So for example, pre and post testing after maybe a literacy intervention or exposing people to fact checks. Then of course, ethnographic research methods and certainly investigative journalism have been really important tools in making clear the structure and motivations of disinformation campaigns. So researchers and also reporters play a major role in really illuminating the information disorder in this ecosystem. But of course, as usual, they come with methodological and contextual challenges. So in terms of methodological challenges, we always have issues of social science research methods. So how do we design tests to measure the impact of interventions, measuring the propensity to believe certain kinds of statements? There's a lot of debate in social science about that. Then there's, of course, challenges in mapping. For example, if you're trying to map the spread of a rumor or an idea or a statement, that can be difficult because it won't always stay on a platform, right? It might start on Facebook, then somebody takes a screenshot and it goes to WhatsApp, and then it becomes word of mouth maybe, so you have no trail at all. So looking at sort of the long-term tentacles of some of these disinformation campaigns can be a bit challenging because it's not always traceable as such. Then, of course, censorship and political environments can make it quite difficult for both journalists and researchers. So we talked a bit yesterday in the introduction about how sometimes the charge of fake news is used by states to silence dissent. And sometimes it can be quite dangerous to do this research as well, especially on disinformation campaigns that might be connected back to the states. So challenges both for the researcher and in terms of uncovering that knowledge. And then finally, one big challenge is, of course, even if we succeed in illuminating the problem, how can we translate our research findings into actual practice, whether that's advocating for a policy change or trying to change something at a community or grassroots level? How can we actually put those into action? So those are some of our reflections on that section. So I'll invite Helani Galpaya, she's the CEO of Learnasia, to introduce the panelists and kick off our final panel.
Thank you, Ramati. Could we all, the panelists at least, come online if the bandwidth is supportive and on video, please? That would be really helpful for the audience. Thank you, everybody. Really great to have you here. We have a really interesting set of speakers because we have people who do serious investigative journalism, people who do serious research, and some who are doing both. We will start. I've asked the panelists to tell us a little bit about what they would consider some of their interesting pieces of research or investigative journalism and what was found related to the global phenomena as it works out in their countries or regions. And to talk a little bit about sort of methods and challenges as well, which we will get to in the panel discussion. So let's start with Jason Cabañez from the Department of Communication, De La Salle University in the Philippines, whose sort of reporting was really quite fascinating to read when we were doing this report.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to this forum. I'm looking forward to the discussions that we'll continue to have after the fascinating panel earlier as well, which I caught. So for my short opening intervention, I just want to do a quick sketch of the trajectory of my research regarding digital disinformation. I actually stumbled into this field whilst I was part of the British Council-funded Newton Tech for Dev network, co-leading the network stream on digital labor, actually. In one of the interviews that my co-researcher, Jonathan Ong of University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I were conducting with Filipino digital workers, the participant shared with us that he did gig work for political campaigns, and it sounded very much like disinformation. So this led us to investigate the behind the scenes of creating and disseminating fake news and political trolling online. As media and communication scholars, both of us took a production studies approach to the phenomenon. We conceptualized this information as both product and process, emerging from organizational structures, labor relations, and entrepreneurial subjectivities. This allowed us to spotlight the broader systems and cultures of practice that normalize and incentivize the everyday work arrangements of producing fake news and political trolling online. By moving away from the usual starting point of naming and shaming disinformation producers as exceptional villains, and instead listening to their intentions and experiences, we got to a closer understanding of one, the social conditions that have led them to their work, two, the cultural scripts they use to justify their work to others and also to themselves, and crucially, number three, the opaque institutional procedures that have allowed their work to continue to flourish and actually really expand quite rapidly. In the last couple of years, however, I realized that an inadvertent consequence of this focus on this information production is that it contributes to rehearsing the quote-unquote powerful media weak audiences approach, but this time for our digital age. Indeed, a lot of today's moral panics about digital disinformation tend to overinflate the manipulative power of technologies and assume that what we have are dumbed down social media users who are unable to recognize truths and lies. So in my more recent work with my digital hijacking of deep stories team, with the historian Fernando Santiago and our research associate Hannah Sab, both of De La Salle University, we really sought to explore what I've been calling the imaginative dimension of digital disinformation. This refers to the cultural, emotional, and narratival roots of fake news and political trolling online. This has enabled us to bring front and center how this information actually works, and it's by connecting, amplifying, and or undermining people's shared social narratives about their socio-political world and what they can do within this world. In our ethnographic interviews with precarious middle-class Filipinos, which we did a few months before the recently concluded elections here in the Philippines, we identified the shared social narratives that they grew from in interpreting online disinformation about two particular issues. One is on COVID-19 racism against the Chinese, and historical distortion about the Philippines martial law era. We also characterized the socially embedded media consumption practices that kind of contextualize their interpretation of such disinformation. I've recently written up about our data regarding COVID-19 racism, just came out in the International Journal of Cultural Studies. But unfortunately, we're still working on our analysis about historical distortion. So more on that in the near future. And to end on a hopeful note, I'm just now actually beginning research that builds on my initial foray into thinking about counter disinformation initiatives that harness this imaginative dimension of communication. Instead of proposing principles from the top down, I will take a bottom-up approach to identifying potential ways forward as regards using the very strategies of digital information against it. Inspired by a politics of possibility, quote unquote, this project will seek out already existing counter-disinformation campaigns in the Philippines that seriously attend to the imaginative dimension of communication. The hope is that this exercise will generate broader conceptual insights about how counter-disinformation work in the country can more powerfully harness this imaginative dimension. Moreover, the exercise is also meant to be a starting point for a reflective conversation about the successes and failures of those involved in such endeavors across the Asian region. So I think I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Jason. That was sort of useful, and for anyone who's interested, obviously his research is sort of well publicized and sort of various versions are available online. Let me call on Ramsha Jahangir, who also interestingly studies this phenomena of information production with her journalist hat on. She's an investigative journalist from Pakistan. Again, her writing you can find online. Ramsha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me on this very, very diverse and relevant panel. So I'll bring on a very journalistic approach, less theoretical insight into the issue. So just to give a bit of context, I've been covering disinformation and the use of the digital space by political parties and politicians in Pakistan for the past few years. And in the previous government, which was the PTI government under Imran Khan, things became heavily digitalized, and it was also the first prime minister for Pakistan to use Twitter for official communication. And my research now, I'm also in the process of finishing my master's dissertation, and I'm focusing on this concept of digital parties and rise of populism, especially in South Asia, and also in comparison to the rest of the world, what are common trends, and how does this affect the media space and the information environment? So what I've found based on my research and investigative reporting in the last few years is the impact on mainstream media. Because when governments, politicians, political workers prefer alternate media spaces, digital media spaces over mainstream media, the role of gatekeepers, which traditional media has, is removed. And what happens is that when there is direct access with the public and there's no gatekeeping, propaganda and fake news, misinformation, disinformation spreads faster. And this is what happened, and we've noticed elsewhere in South Asia as well, that now governments are tapping into the use of their volunteer base to fact check journalists, fact check activists, and basically flush out any narrative or information that is critical of them or opposes their view. And this recent trend of using volunteers, political workers, on digital platforms to amplify only the state narrative and not allow critical narrative to stay online is very, very problematic, especially in oppressive countries where press freedom, such as in Pakistan, is very, very low, and which is why Pakistan's press freedom declined in the last few years as well. So essentially what happens is, what does traditional media do in this case when it's a reality that politicians everywhere are now going to tap into digital space? They are going to use, so recently Imran Khan, for instance, hosted a podcast, also hosted a Twitter space, which saw record-breaking numbers. So what does mainstream media do when they use these kind of resources for information? The essential idea is to go back to investigative reporting, because it's very easy. There is no exclusive news reporting left in this current environment. Of course, news spreads faster on WhatsApp first, and then it comes on TV channels. And even in newsrooms, we're looking at social media where news often breaks now. So we need to move from the exclusive reporting model to doing a more investigative model. And this is what helped my reporting as well. So when I covered these networks, these disinformation networks, and these volunteers who were posing as fact checkers or who were harassing or spreading government disinformation, what helped was transparently show how the use of alternate media can also be a problematic alternate to ignoring mainstream media, because the public has a lot of mistrust in mainstream media, but they have more trust in alternate media right now. But we need to talk about these things in a more detailed and transparent manner, how this can be problematic, how YouTubers are not journalists, how anyone can make millions on these platforms, but that doesn't mean that their sourcing is credible. We need to still challenge and question where their information is coming from. And all the things that we apply to mainstream media also now need to be applied to those as well, especially them, because there's no gatekeeping involved. So that's one of the areas that I'm very recently interested in. And of course, it's not very limited to Pakistan, but it's also prevalent everywhere else, especially due to the rise of populist leaders and their use of digital media.
Thank you, Ramsha. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I have loads of questions methodologically, how you actually go and identify and talk to these people, but we'll get to that. Let's right now bring in Kayu Mimizuka, who used to work for the Kyoto News as a journalist and is now an independent journalist. But interestingly, she wears the other hat. She's also a PhD student. And I think studying this phenomena and many others. So it's a really interesting thing from moving from one to the other. Kayo, you have the floor.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kayo. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited to be here today. I was introduced now, I'm currently pursuing my doctoral degree at the University of Texas, Austin, but I've worked as a journalist in the past years based in Japan. So I think I'll be focusing on the research that I'm just working on right now. I'm currently working on a couple research projects, both solo and collaborative ones, but one that's probably most relevant to the region Asian region is the one in which I'm looking into the localization of QAnon conspiracy theory in Japan. And then I think you probably already know this, but QAnon used to be sort of like a fringe online conspiracy originating in the US, but it has become a global movement, and local chapters have developed sort of their own subculture in various countries. And interestingly, Japan, alongside Germany and Brazil, is one of the nations where QAnon community has been growing most rapidly. But patterns of localization or globalization and how conspiracy theories and disinformation from the US are adapted, amended, and redistributed is a relatively under-researched area. So there needs to be a more global perspective, because when it comes to, you know, these right-wing movements or, you know, conspiratory movements, it might be because I'm based in the United States right now, but, you know, it's very like, you know, Eurocentric, and we have to bring more of a global perspectives into the conversation. So just to give you a context, I've been, when I was working as a journalist for Kyodo News, I was covering disinformation and digital literacy, but things have changed a lot since then. And, you know, QAnon is a relatively new phenomenon. And there are two distinct chapters of QAnon in Japan. One is known for sort of its reverence for Michael Flynn, who was a close aide to Donald Trump. And, you know, this group is known for actively importing and translating QAnon content. They take a lot of sort of pride in accurately translating QAnon content, which is very interesting, while the other group is basically an anti-vaccine group, and they're disseminating COVID-related misinformation. They're also very actively holding offline anti-vax rallies. And, you know, we see a lot of misinformation about the war in Ukraine that they disseminate. So it's kind of like a hodgepodge thing when we look at, you know, the social media channels where they gather. So the research questions, mine happens to be focusing on Japan, but, you know, these phenomena is not only, you know, just happening in one country, but, you know, there are a lot of things that we can share in common in different regions and countries. But my questions are, how are these Japanese arms of QAnon make sense of US QAnon and ideologies? Do they follow the same conspiracy theories or amend them to the local context? There are differences in the way that two Japanese groups localized or globalized the US movement. And I'm also interested in what types of easily personalized content, such as slogans and memes, are used to connect the US and Japanese QAnon groups beyond the differences in language and cultures and ideologies. So I think these are important research questions to better understand how conspiracy theories and misinformation spread beyond national borders, despite cultural and language barriers. And I am drawing mainly on qualitative methods, including interviews, discourse analysis, and sometimes also digital ethnography. But I think we can also interview journalists, practitioners, and, you know, there are also internet users and community organizations who are using digital tools to tackle, you know, these harmful content and beliefs. And I think another thing that is interesting to pay attention to, which I could talk more later, but is the use of the closed messaging app, or like in the case of Japan, it's Line messaging app by one of the QAnon groups. They, you know, they mainly rely on the Line app, and there are, you know, so-called open chat groups through which they solicit members very actively. They plan demonstrations offline, and it's a very popular messaging app in Japan, Taiwan, and I think in Thailand as well. And it's rife with, you know, spams and also COVID-related misinformation, but there's a huge research gap, at least in Japan. I know a lot of journalists, you know, in Thailand and Taiwan are tackling, you know, this problem on the Line messaging app, but I think this is a relatively under-researched area, you know, because it's kind of seen as a fringe app from a global perspective, but, you know, are very influential in some countries in our region. So yeah, I would like to hear or like connect with people who are working on similar issues. Yeah, that's my introduction.
That's great. Thank you, Kayo, for that. Lots of questions, particularly about the WhatsApp groups that you're studying. Finally, let's ask Guliza Hasyakupoglu from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU in Singapore, the Nanyang Technological University. She has done, actually interestingly, a lot of diverse research on gender, security, Malaysian elections, and so on. Guliza, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. I know my name and the institution are a mouthful, so it always takes time. Well, my research mainly focuses on influence operations, including disinformation campaigns, as well as online harms, including gender threats in digital space and online advocacy. So the very first study that I did into disinformation was actually a collaborative study that I conducted with my PhD mentor back in 2013-14 on Gezi movements. So that particular study tried to understand how activists in Gezi movement invested trust in information and trust in one another amidst the information pollution. So we interviewed 21 activists to sort of get to the findings, which I'm sure we'll have time to discuss later in the discussions. But since that study, I've, like you said, had the opportunity to engage in studies looking at wide variety of aspects of influence operations. And while that particular study was concerning Turkey, most of my other studies have actually focused on the Southeast Asia and the wider region. So let me just tell you two of the things that are currently occupying me rather than providing a broader overview. So currently I'm finalizing a working paper on the use of traditional media in influence operations in Taiwan. This study is based on the data that I collected via 24 interviews that I did with people working on different various aspects of influence operations as well as disinformation campaigns in Taiwan, ranging from fact checkers to government officials to academics to people employed in think tanks, whatnot. And I collected these the data from the interviews via field trips that I conducted in 2018 and 19. And here comes one of the hardships when you have a lot of other work going on at the same time: transcription, data analysis, and then all the intricacies of going through the data multiple times takes actually quite a bit of time. So this is one of the studies that is gonna come out of this bulk of data that I collected couple of years ago in a way. So just to briefly share what the findings are from this study, based on the interview accounts as well as the literature review, the study suggests that three intersecting issues need attention and improvement to achieve a more balanced and clean media environment that is less vulnerable to influence. One is industry pressures, including competition, drive to get audience, immediate news, underfunding, and related to these media's financial affiliations and dealings. Two, journalistic practices and norms, as well as the news production dynamics, including content and source quality related issues, fact-checking practices, and accountability of the traditional media. And the third one is the reach of traditional media, including the reach and targeting related issues. Another work that is keeping me busy lately is an edited volume on gender security and digital space that I co-edited with a colleague. The volume involves 9 chapters, including a chapter from me and my co-editor. And it mainly calls for a look into online harms and cybersecurity concerns from a gendered lens. So contributors involve academics as well as practitioners. So as you can imagine, there are a wide variety of approaches and methodologies that the book covers. And topics stretch from online harassment and its gendered impacts to internet shutdowns and their gendered implications to gendered disinformation and others. Let me just leave it at that to leave a bit more room for discussion later on.
Thank you, Guliza. Lots of things to unpack. So let's start with sort of how these things are actually done. Because one of the biggest challenges as researchers is the data to come to our conclusions. And many of you, actually all of you, rely on interviews, be they sort of people in the field or experts who study the field. So particularly, like let's say Jason and Ramsha, your work requires actually getting access to people who are working the troll factories. How does one do that, and what are the challenges? And what does your sort of positionality? One is a journalist, a woman, Jason, I'm sure people know your sort of political standing and views. How does that affect your access, really? Anybody? Yeah, but let's start with Jason.
Okay, all right. Actually, the way that we, as I kind of recounted slightly in my intervention earlier, it was a bit of a serendipity for us to get into this information work and to look at the producers of digital disinformation. But once we realized that this was happening, for good or bad, I'll speak to as much as I can whilst protecting the identity of my participants, of our participants. But we quickly realized that these people were in our network of networks. And that's because both Jonathan, my co-researcher, and I are both, graduates of communication degrees, undergraduate communication degrees. And a lot of people at the top of the disinformation hierarchy in the Philippines come from the communication media industries. So it was they're actually hiding in plain sight. It's as they've said, it's kind of an open secret who they are, and they were easily reachable through our network of networks because of our our background coming from a particular university and also the kind of networks that we built over the last years. And so it was fairly easy to get to them, particularly when we were doing the research in 2016, 2017. There wasn't a lot of work yet on the production of this information at the time. And I think in hindsight, what we realized is that they were actually quite happy to tell us everything that they were doing, because they saw our report as kind of like free advertising. Like, look at the stuff that we can do and the services we can offer to you as a politician or someone pushing for a particular, a political policy, whatever. And so when we actually came out with the report in 2018, we were slightly expecting some kind of a backlash, because then, we'd reveal our analysis of, our stance on the analysis of what's going on. And we did say that we discovered this kind of like network hierarchy, and we put the blame at the top. The people who are the ad and PR strategists who really know what they're doing, and they're conscious of the consequences of what they're doing to our democracy. But we didn't really get any backlash from them at that time. What made it harder to do the research eventually was when the other studies came out, particularly I think it was an Oxford study that was very critical. And link them to the government. Then we slowly felt that it became increasingly difficult to access our participants. So and although now we are still in touch with very few of them, it's very, very hard to ask them anything anymore that can come out in research, or to refer them. For example, we used to refer them to some journalists who were interested to make them speak anonymously. Now there's a whole lot of resistance now on their part. So there's been a clamping down, which has made further research on the topic quite difficult in the last, maybe I would say 2-3 years.
Even with the promise of anonymity and non-identifiability in the reporting that you do. Okay.
Yeah, so what we think is kind of like there's an maybe or assumption is that there is an intervention from the clients themselves to telling the disinformation producers to stop talking to academics in such an open way.
Yeah. Ramsha?
My experience is a bit different. So initially, when I started reporting, I saw that troll networks and people working for hire in Pakistan were actually very open to interviews, surprisingly, because they strongly believe they're on the right end and they're very proud of the work they do. So they were very, very upfront about the work they do. And initially it was all well. But once the reporting is published is when things start to turn sour. And of course, disinformation reporting comes at the cost of facing disinformation as well. And of course, I've been on the end of facing abuse online and have smear campaigns run against me. It translates over WhatsApp as well. And for days, there were times where I had to mute, block, or use features on platforms to quiet down the noise. And then what happens is once they know you're reporting and exposing their strategies, then they become more and more cautious of talking to you. And then you have a label. Another thing is, like I said previously, mistrust in media. So they're very convinced that the media is doing propaganda and the media is not going to be fair when it comes to reporting their part. So that's another challenge. I was reporting for Dawn, which was always known for being very critical. So that was another challenge, that they refused to talk to you based on the media organization you're representing. Another issue is also, what I've started to realize is propaganda happens on all sides of things. There are media outlets, unfortunately, as well, who do non-transparent reporting or biased reporting. And now, as journalism has also translated into other platforms, for instance, journalists on YouTube, because of financial models, that's another debate. But it's spread out now. It's not just limited to print or electronic media. So what happens is that when journalists, then they start questioning you. If journalists are spreading fake news, why aren't we allowed to do it? Or why is that an issue? So then instead, what happens is, instead of focusing on the disinformation campaign, the focus shifts to what journalists are doing. Blame attribution takes over from political leaders. And what started happening when I published my disinformation reports, that they're attacking journalists. Instead, they started attacking journalists more for trying to hide away or trying to get away with spreading fake news. And instead, they start blaming you for not doing your work. So then it becomes a bit critical, because how do you report transparently and not become part of the propaganda yourself? This is a challenge which is ongoing, and unfortunately, I don't have a straight up answer to how to solve this. But I think one approach to do is to try and balance and report both sides of the thing. So one approach I tried is to humanize these people. So for instance, using blanket terms like trolls is not the best strategy. We need to expand. So are there influencers? Are there political workers? Are there volunteers? Like, you try to assess what they are more comfortable being called. And it's true, not everyone is a troll. So there are a lot of different types of groups spreading disinformation as well. So we need to broaden our definitions and labels, calling trolls. And another thing is, disinformation itself is a very limiting term. We need influence operations, information campaigns. These are also things that we need to introduce when it comes to reporting or even researching, because some of them are not aimed at spreading disinformation, but they could just be like PR campaigns or influence campaigns where they're propagating a political narrative. So broadening definitions, broadening our scope is definitely important. And lastly, I feel another thing that I saw was, when you name and mention these disinformation groups, you amplify their narrative as well. And that's another challenge. So you're trying not to amplify disinformation, but when you report on them, then obviously you're reaching more people and showing them that this campaign was being run. So then in the end, we stopped naming the hashtags, for instance, of the campaign. So for instance, if it's an anti-army campaign, we say it's an anti, and not mention the hashtag itself, so it doesn't get more reach and it's not amplified. So there are turnarounds to report on this, but definitely it's a challenge.
That's right, huge challenges. And particular challenges arising, I think, Kayo, from, closed groups that, in a way, this production is kind of like a closed cabal as well, with lots of people participating. They've accessed that. but studying how propagation works in closed groups like WhatsApp groups is particularly difficult. I mean, could you sort of reflect on sort of how you do that very briefly and what are the challenges? And a question maybe for everybody, you know, nobody here is talking about how we study propagation by looking at network theory and, you know, how messages travel. There's been some work done there. So we'll start with Kayo, and then I want to come to Guliza, sort of talking about impacts and how you study that and the ethics around it, the impact of these things on people, because you do, for example, study the impacts on women on some of, you know, these issues. Kayo, we'll start with you, particularly on the closed groups.
Sure. So I'm looking at Line app. It's kind of confusing to say Line app because it's online, but it's Line. And then I think it's a big challenge to study this app. I know that there are more research on WhatsApp groups, for example, because it's more, you know, globally popular, but Line, it's kind of an app that is, like, as I mentioned, it's only used in a few countries in Asia, and I don't really see a lot of research around it. So I was looking at Line when I was studying QAnon and the disinformation that they disseminate. But, you know, like when there is a lot of media attention, when some of the members of the QAnon group got arrested, for example, you know, they become more cautious. And, you know, what used to be sort of semi-open, you know, public group chats are now closed, and, like, you know, it gets, you know, more difficult for us to access the data because they make it, you know, not public anymore. And then, you know, there is a lot of, you know, knowledge accumulated in terms of how we can, you know, download these text messages. And because of how these app platforms work, you know, you can't really download, you know, all the data, like, you know, using Twitter API and stuff. So that has been a big challenge. But what I have been doing is to really try to get, you know, access, or like try to be, you know, part of these groups as soon as possible once you realize that something's going on. And that's kind of an important thing. And also you can utilize, you know, qualitative interviews. There are, like, you know, online users who have been looking at and kind of monitoring these groups for much longer time than I have, and they have access and then they know what's going on, and they're sort of sometimes infiltrating into these groups to, you know, call out on, you know, racist or, you know, bad information that they're circulating in these groups. So, you know, you can start from finding or identifying people who have been monitoring, or, you know, like on like a voluntary basis, you know, looking at these groups, and then, you know, through interviewing them, you can kind of locate, okay, so where are these, you know, groups, and how maybe, you know, can we know more about what's happening in these groups, even though you don't really have access to the groups now. But it is a major challenge, and I think there needs to be more accommodations from the operators of those messaging apps. And also I think there needs to be more collaboration and, you know, opportunities for sharing knowledge and, you know, what we've done so far across countries and cultures.
That's great, thank you. Guliza, on the impacts and harms and sort of the ethics around maybe some of what, you know, Kayo was talking as well, sort of making yourself part of the group, pretending in a way to be part of that, sort of the people who drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, so let me take a step back and say, actually, my individual studies don't necessarily do impact measurement. So I'm currently involved in one study that is done collaboratively with 2 other scholars, and it's based on experimental surveys, which is seeking to understand how, like, the efficacy of the correction measures, to say. So experimental surveys may help with that to an extent, because, like, you know, you do interventions and then you test out. But when it comes to looking at the efficacy of influence operations or efficacy of countermeasures, it's a bit tricky, right? Because first of all, as in a publication that was released last year, as Wilmer argues, efficacy is context-based. So you first have to define what efficacy is for that particular context. And then time, actor, situation would also be factors that would be influencing how you define or who defines efficacy. Once you reach your definition, then you also have like two issues, right? So one is we do have studies that look into the effectiveness of fact checking. We do have studies that come out of the psychology of misinformation area that looks into how people evaluate information, how they invest trust in information, how they, whether the correction mechanisms make sense to people in a particular defined context. But what we're lacking is how, looking at how countermeasures adopted by governments and social media companies, for instance, are showing impacts on the ground. How do they translate? So I feel like there's a gap there. And actually in 2021, there was one Carnegie Endowment report that came out that looked into the question of efficacy. And one of the things that they mentioned was how there are limited studies studying the effectiveness of influence activities to begin with. And out of those that study it, most of them focus on traditional media. And those that focus on social media disproportionately focus on Facebook and Twitter. But influence operations don't happen in these two platforms only, right? We need to stretch it and focus on other platforms as well, because they also jump from one platform to the other. Then as to the countermeasures, like I said, there are studies on the fact-checking side. There are studies that come out of the psychology of misinformation side. But research into the effectiveness of policy and laws, for instance, is an area that definitely needs more investment. And while doing that, it not only requires investment in terms of like expanding the studies, but also exploring how we study the question more effectively. And on the ethics side, well, there's the first step of going through the institutional review board application, which all by itself actually allows us to put certain things into context. So one of the challenges that I had in my past interview engagements was actually with regards to interviewing with activists, because some of them wouldn't want to, they wouldn't want to have things recorded, or they would want to make sure that their identities are hidden, and they would want to make sure that, you're taking care of the data with utmost diligence. Now, there's the ethics aspect to that, and there's also the aspect of receiving their trust and then really following up with it. Yeah, so maybe let me just leave it at that, as I've already taken a bit of time, and then open the floor to other panelists as well.
That brings up my two last questions. One is really, this issue around data. So even to run experiments to understand effectiveness, given the importance of social media, many of the methodologies require some kind of partnership or data from the platforms themselves, right? This is a reason why, everyone studies Twitter, because you can get it through an API, or you use CrowdTangle to use Facebook data, but only the public posts. So in an ideal world, we want access to everything, but that's also really problematic. Who's a bona fide, researcher, and who's a bad actor? How do we actually, sort of navigate that? And how do social media platforms navigate that, other than doing all the research on their own? But we know they can't do this because they need the local contextual knowledge. So what is the one piece of data that you hope somebody outside would give you, and who, that would help your research? I mean, one stream of data. I don't mean one piece of data, but. Kayo, you're working with Line.
Sure. I would love to, I wish like every app had something like Twitter API, where academics can access all the data, because my challenge is I'm still kind of trying to figure out how, I can effectively collect data of text messages. I mean, when it's a private chat, it becomes much harder, but there are some semi-public group chats, they call it open chat groups, which, technically you can, anyone is, able to join, if you answer like a few questions, or like they don't really like, ask you to, give your ID and stuff. So it's possible. But in the case of Line, for example, like you have to be part of the group, and then you can only, go back like for 6 months or so, and you have to download the text messages like every day, like for each day, that like, it's like a very time consuming process. And I wonder, if there is any better way that, any of you know. But yeah, I think that would be great if, academics can kind of get some sort of way to, connect to data through like something like Twitter API. Maybe that's not feasible when it comes to, messaging apps, because it's sort of different from social platforms. But I definitely think that there needs to be more support and accommodation from the side of the platforms. And I think, their policies and, how, they, tackle misinformation, and in how they grant access or like, support academic research also has to do with how, journalists are telling stories about certain apps, and how these apps and, what's happening on these apps are perceived. If it's not reported very much, of course, like Line app, for example, kind of gets away with it, although there is a lot of misinformation, disinformation going on the app. But, because it's kind of not reported that way as much as, we see a lot of reports on Facebook and Twitter, for example, I think they can get away with it. So I think it would be also interesting to look at, what are the stories that are told about these apps, and how does that shape platforms, policies, and, their attitudes towards, how to support academics and stuff like that. So that's what I'm also interested in.
Anyone else wants to come in, or I can just ask my last question, maybe in the interest of time. Let's just pause that. I would like everyone to think in a world where funding is not a challenge, and you've got the support of your bosses, Ramsha, if you were doing, this for a newspaper. What's the most important and relevant research question you could answer? Not because it's intellectually fabulous to answer, but it can have a huge impact on the damaging and problematic impacts the information disorder has in the world.
I think it's also tied with the previous question. So 2 things, if I found out, my life would be easier. One is from the platform side is information about government requests, because even though they report numbers, they don't specify what the requests are and what violation of the law is the request being filed under. So a detailed data of that.
That's right, on the transparency reporting.
Yes,
that's a really important one, which you haven't even got to, and that's a really important data source. Great. So what would you study?
And I would study how much government spending is actually going into these groups without any barriers. And if I have the numbers for that, I think it will be an end for all disinformation groups once and for all, I think.
Ability to follow the money. Okay, great. Thank you. Jason?
To me, really, what I think needs to be answered is, because I'm thinking really that the only way we can confront digital disinformation is through a whole of society approach, right? Like different sectors of society working together, because there's no one answer to it. And if I really had, no constraints, funding, time, etc., I would really want to explore the kind of collaborations that can happen between platforms, the ad and PR industry, the mainstream media, academics, civil society. What are the possibilities for them to work together to create an environment where digital disinformation becomes all the harder? Best practices when it comes to ethics, for instance. How do you do media literacy? How do you put out counter disinformation narratives that also kind of use popular culture the way that disinformation producers do that? They weaponize pop culture. How can we turn that on its head? And I really think there needs to be so much more conversation across people from different sectors, because we can't have this like disjointed response, each of us trying to do different things.
Sorry, I was on mute. Guliza, you.
Actually, let me just double Jason on that, because I really think that's an important point. And when I was thinking of the collaboration aspect, I was also thinking of how, like, I mean, let alone solving big questions, because you know, we're still taking baby steps, and there's a lot of room for improvement. I wish there was more engagement after every single report release, for instance. Like, you know, whenever there's a takedown, whenever there's an announcement of an influence operation being discovered, it's great to read the report, but I wish there were more opportunities to ask questions that emerged on the spot. Like, I don't know, avenues for that, both for platforms as well as for the governments.
Wonderful, thank you. So a lot more engagement and then follow up from those. Kyle.
I would actually echo very much with Jason as well. I would love to, see more collaborations, interdisciplinary collaborations among academics, journalists, librarians, community members, and all of that. But also, I would like to collaborate more with the researchers and journalists in the APAC region. We tend to, especially like when we're in, because I'm based in the United States, it's just really hard to, in terms of, the physical distance, and also in terms of like funding and everything, these big projects that include a lot of researchers from different regions can be a challenging thing. But I think, given that, information travels and the flows of information and communication is now really like, it doesn't have to do with national borders. And we need, a lot of expertise, in terms of languages and cultures. And, what I'm looking at in terms of QAnon is also, cross-cultural, and it doesn't have to do only just with Japan and US, but, if you can broaden these perspectives, if you have more expertise in the same team. And I think that'll be really my dream, to work more with research and journalists and just build knowledge together in the region. And I think this panel has been a really great opportunity for me to connect with people like you, and I really like to thank all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we've just about scratched the surface. There could probably be a 2 to 3 day conversation around a meaningful research agenda, challenges, and how we solve them, including the data problem, the funding problem, and occasionally the capacity problem in our part of the world in trying to address this. And really, I think what all of you are highlighting is the need to work together, because everyone is trying to use different methodologies to really study. It's like studying the elephant from different parts, right? And we're seeing our little part, well, the elephant looks a particular way, and if we put our heads together, we can probably do that. So thank you very much for a really tight and short session. I'm sorry we've run out of time. And I would like to thank just overall, not just this panel, but the wonderful panelists we've had yesterday and today, really engaged, and with the sort of gun to their heads with 4-minute, 5-minute interventions. We intentionally kept it very short because we can't explore all of these in depth. I also need to thank Ramati Gayashi and my team, who not only did the research with the other partners, but really sort of got this organized and invited all of you, and Azza for translations in Russian during various points of the day. I think, this report was an attempt to address this issue in the global South, because so much of the research is about how it works in Europe or America. And that's useful. Methodologically, I find it quite enriching to see how they do it. I also see the similarities, but I think we need to study the phenomena, and all of you are doing this. We need to find solutions, pass our laws, and develop our people's capacity to be slightly perhaps more skeptical about the nature of knowledge. So the digital literacy media training is important. So this was intentionally an effort to have a global South discussion, particularly on Asia. Similar things will happen in Africa and Latin America. And I'm really happy because we had 15 countries represented. We had more if you study, like you guys study multiple countries, but really where you come from, we had at least 15 countries represented here. We had 15 women and 10 men talking throughout the two events, not the participants, but the panelists. And I think that's a huge thing. There was not a single panel that didn't have a majority of women, and I'm really happy about that. And I think except for 3 speakers who are deeply engaged in issues of the Global South, based in the Global South, but are from the Global North, except for those 3, everyone else has their roots or is working or studying and really from the Global South. I think we should sort of really take note of all of these events, these sort of statistics as well when we host these events. So thank you to everybody. We will be in touch and hopefully we'll work with all of you once again. Thank you.